now. To those of you that are also in EDL 700, I didn't even give you a breather between classes tonight. So we don't have quite as much to talk about as we did in 700 tonight. So maybe we'll get through a little bit quicker. So tonight what I want to talk to you about is data analysis, and the title is actually fact versus fiction. So, I've been thinking a lot about data and how to go about using it and the kind of stuff that is going to be most beneficial and helpful to you. One of the things that I know Dr. Perry and I both feel really, really strongly about in the MEDL program is to make sure that we are giving you things that you can actually take and use. Possibly even use in your current position, but certainly use in the future as you move and grow in your leadership. So, data analysis used to be, back in the old days when I was first coming through, a very manual process. So literally you're going through and you're counting scores, you're doing averages, you're creating charts and graphs, trying to put data into a usable form. But as we have grown and as we've had technological advances, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the fact that there are lots of software companies out there that you feed the data in a very raw form, and they will spit it back out to you in just about any format that you want. They'll do your charts, they'll do your graphs, they'll do your disaggregation, they'll do your analysis, etc. So the emphasis that we used to have on analyzing and disaggregating data really is kind of different. So the more I thought about it, I thought, you know what, I need to make sure that we have a clear understanding about the role data needs to play in our daily work as well as our long-term planning. And at the end of the day, data should be nothing more than one of the tools in your toolbox to help improve student achievement. So let's talk about fact versus fiction. We all hear all the time the phrase data-driven schools. It's what I call the catchphrase of the day. There are those terms that come and go in education. I'm sure we've all heard them. There was a time when the big rage was smaller learning communities. Another time, content-based instruction, cultural literacy. There's been all of these movements and phrases that we're supposed to be able to implement and use. But I want to remind us, and so I want us to really think about, what is data? Data is very simply, a lot of people, when you say data, they think numbers. Data can be numbers. It can also be anecdotal. It can be words. It can be all kinds of things. But it is a way for us to express ideas in quantifiable ways. Data has very little value in and of itself. We can collect mounds and mounds of data, but what we do with that data is what matters. So many of you know, because I've talked with several of you, we have been in the process of we've moved, we've done a whole bunch of sort of fruit basket turnover stuff here in the business education building at LSUS. So I'm really excited. I'm actually in a new office. I have a window. I'm no longer in my box, so that's exciting. But one of the things that our dean challenged us to do was to go through and to really take a hard look at all of these materials and memos and data reports and stuff that were filling file cabinet after file cabinet after file cabinet here in the building. So I was tasked with going through some of the education records. And I will tell you, I was a little shocked. I came to the conclusion as I was going through records that we had, every time they would fill a file cabinet with information, they would just buy a new file cabinet. They never did a purge. They didn't follow records retention or anything like that. I found student information from 1974 that was on typewriter paper. In fact, most of you are probably too young to even remember what typewriter paper was, but for those of us that wrote our thesis on an actual typewriter, not a computer, that really thin, crinkly kind of paper, I found all kinds of that stuff. By the time we finished purging and culling through, we hired a shredding company to come on campus, and just for the business and education departments, we shredded over 5 tons of paper. Now, why do I tell you that? We were certainly data rich when you have 5 tons worth of stuff that needs to be shredded. but we were also action poor because all they did was collect it and file it. They didn't use it to impact anything. So remember, data is important, but it has in and of itself no value at all. For data to be useful, there has to be context, understanding, analysis, and interpretation. But most importantly, there has to be action behind it. Data is the building block. So if you think about, for those of you that are either in the PLC course or you've already had it, you know how we talk about in the PLC, it's a cycle that, you're going to talk about data, you're going to plan instruction, you're going to look at assessment, you're going to look at student work, it's kind of this cycle of things. Data is one component of an effective instructional teaching and learning system. Far too often, we tend to think that data decides everything. Data should inform everything, but that does not necessarily mean that we're going to be using it to decide everything. What we should be focused on instead of data-driven schools are knowledge-driven schools. So I want you just to kind of think for a minute. What's the difference here? Data-driven schools versus knowledge-driven schools. Well, we know data has a place and it has to be organized. It has to be put into some sort of meaningful context or pattern. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that you are the new principal of a school and you are just thrilled beyond thrilled when you get all your data reports. You've had an average growth index of 26 points. Sounds pretty impressive. Well, without the context, we don't really know whether that's a great growth rate or not. Now, if you were sitting with only 10% of your students passing and you showed a 25 or 26 growth index, that's phenomenal, but you're still not at the passing standard. Versus you're a principal of a school and you had a -2 drop in student achievement. Well, maybe you were a really high-performing school and you were sitting at 98% meeting the standard. A 2% drop, you're still way above the average and the standard. So context really matters when you're talking about data. You also have to put data into meaningful patterns and transform it. Now, what do I mean by that? Again, raw data is helpful, but it's really hard for teachers to deal with mounds of raw data, particularly, the way it comes back oftentimes from your state or from your district. So we have to take that data and put it into something that we can easily digest and use. So that might be a chart or a graph or a narrative or something along those lines. I think I shared this with my last class, but I think it's really appropriate for you guys too. Our dean here at LSUS is a very data-driven person. And so she's been looking at and tracking enrollment across programs. And so she, and I've seen the numbers because I help work with those numbers all the time. But she took all of the data from 2012 to 2018 and just charted it for us in terms of enrollment numbers. And it was really astounding when I actually saw the graph, because we had some programs that are flatlining. They're just, they're just hovering right around the same number, no growth, no reduction, whatever, over the last 6-7 years. Other programs were, had a pretty high enrollment, and you just see this steady, gradual drop. Some of our programs were very low enrollment. I'll give you MEDL was one of them. Back in 2012, they had a grand total of 7 students in the entire program. And you see that they're rocking along. They go like 7 to 10 the next year in 2013, and then like 12 in 2014, 15 in 2016. And then Dr. Perry came along, and he absolutely revolutionized the program, and you see this huge, you're just bottom along the chart, and all of a sudden you see this huge spike. So her taking this data and putting it into these visuals was really, really powerful. That's what we have to help do with our teachers. Data has to be then translated. Not only do we need to know and understand the numbers, but more importantly, we have to glean understanding from it. We have to glean knowledge. And then that knowledge is what we use to go into action. So how much time should you spend with data? I wouldn't spend more than 45 minutes to 60 minutes a month on it. You could spend more, but I would say no more than that, once or even twice a month. But that's really about it. Because if you spend more time in data, guess what you're not doing? You're not translating it into knowledge and understanding, and therefore you're not acting upon it. Data must drive planning, teaching, instruction, and then that must translate into the actual action of doing what we need to do. The other part of it too is data should not be disaggregated, analyzed, or looked at in isolation. I know back in the day as a principal, I would spend hours upon hours upon hours analyzing data in my office. And then I finally kind of woke up one day and went, that's pretty stupid, because I understand the data, but I'm not in the classroom every day with all of our students. I need my teachers to understand the data. So data is best done as a collaborative, social kind of effort. When it's done in teams, you'll get better understanding, more in-depth interpretation, and better knowledge and better actions on the other side of it. So, how do you move just beyond the numbers? Guys, anybody can do data. I know a lot of people really are like, oh my gosh, it's numbers and math and statistics and all that. Data in its best form is something that people can actually use. It's not something that you just go through and check off the box when you do it. And it's also something that if you're relying solely on historical data, again, that's only marginally useful. It's sort of like driving with only looking in your rearview mirror. It's nice to know where you've been, but it's sure not going to help you to get where you're going. When we're looking at data, critical questions, very simple. So what do we know from our data that's working? Okay. What do we know from our data that's not working? And then the most important question of all, what are we going to do about it? That should be the crux of a data meeting, is to analyze and understand and then ask yourselves what's working. Those are your strengths. Those are your celebrations. What's not working? Okay, these are our problem areas. Now, what are we going to do to sustain what's working, but also fix what's not working? Also, too, when you are working on data, I would make that sort of a sacred time period so that you can really focus on what needs to be done. So like we've talked about in other classes, you need to have an agenda with time limits. People should have roles and responsibilities. There should be norms and expectations. Lots of tools that make this easy. I would never just hand teacher data sets and walk away. I would hand them a data set and then I'd give them a tool that they can use and a protocol that they can use and a process, and I might even model it for them. I would sit with them and ask them those questions that spur their thinking. So that's one thing I loved about the DataWise book. There's tons of protocols that can definitely be used. And so they should be planned, and like we've talked about with PLCs, there are lots of things that need to happen to make sure this actually works. So thinking about, your data, let's assume that. You've got it analyzed, you've got a protocol, and now you're thinking about, okay, I have my knowledge, what am I going to do to put it into action? So what I want to really have you think long and hard about, how do you establish either long-term achievement or how do you maintain long-term achievement? Unfortunately, we are living in a day and education where we tend to think that achievement happens only through remediation. We spend all of our time thinking about RTI and how are we going to, data tells me this about this child, and the data tells me this about this other child. And we're forcing teachers to almost teach individually every single student to get them where they need to be. And we can talk about differentiation all we want and meeting the needs of multiple kinds of learners and things like that. But the reality is, guys, you do not sustain or improve achievement through remediation. It is at best a short-term strategy that will have small incremental results. Improving student achievement over time that is sustainable and enriching must happen when we work with our people. So what we have to focus on from our data is good, first, quality instruction. So our data is telling us that our students need to master, pick an objective. Let's go with ELA. And students need to be able to write a 5-paragraph essay and include the main idea and supporting details with the use of figurative language. Well, you know what? I can remediate the students who don't get that, but I shouldn't have to if I've really done the kind of work I need to do to plan a highly effective lesson. So we know from the data, we know from the standard that that has to be taught. The time should be spent on developing high-quality lessons and high-quality tasks that are rigorous and relevant, that are going to lead to our students' achievement. We also have to make sure that we are following and using the CI, what I call the CIA triad. So we focus on curriculum, instruction, and then of course the assessment helps us to know what should be in the curriculum, what we should teach, and that should lead to success on the assessment. Again, a cycle. Far too often though, guys, we are not critical consumers of our curriculum. So, you know, we're handed the state curriculum, we're handed the district curriculum, we're handed the department curriculum, and we all assume that it's high quality. Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but I will tell you at least 9 out of 10 times, that is not the best quality curriculum. So you have to spend time. If you know that your students are struggling in these areas, but they're soaring in these, tie that directly to the curriculum. So if they're doing really well in a particular standard or content area, that tells you the curriculum is probably pretty strong. But if they're failing, before you start thinking about remediation for students, instead, look at the quality of the curriculum. And if the curriculum's not getting you to where you need to go, you need to fix it. If the curriculum's good, but you're not delivering instruction effectively, that's where it needs to be fixed. And when you do this well, if we go back to that RTI model or thought process, 90% at the minimum of your students should master an objective or a standard when it is taught the first time. I honestly think it should be more like 95%, but we'll go with 90. 10%, so if 90% get it the first time, that next 10%, if you reteach it one more time in a different way, you should get everybody to master that through a reteach activity or lesson, except for maybe 1 or 2%. That 1 or 2% might need in-depth remediation. But unfortunately, what I see happening time after time after time is 50% of the students get it the first time, and we try to remediate the other 50%. We cannot do that. It's not sustainable. So the other part of it, too, is just a reminder. We have to be more focused on what the students are doing than what the teachers are. So we also not only have to think about curriculum and instruction, we also have to think about the tasks that we're asking students to do. They need to be high value, high quality. They must have rigor. They must be aligned to the standards. So while you're thinking about, you're doing a data meeting and you're going into a PLC and you're planning instruction and all that, spend time creating those really strong student lessons and activities so students are highly engaged with rigorous, thought-provoking work. The last piece of it, too, if you think about the power that a team has in making all this happen, we also need to think about professional development. There is a school of thought that, you know, okay, we see this as a problem, so we're going to do professional development for the whole school on this problem, and everything's great and wonderful. Well, unfortunately, most teachers go to professional development, and even those that have the best intentions do not implement one single thing they learn in professional development in their classroom. Why? Because it's like if we introduce a difficult or new or challenging concept to students only one time, and we expect them to master it, they can't, because they need practice. They need time to really reflect upon it. They need coaching and support. So while professional development is required, I want you to also be thinking about how do you implement systems that make sure that professional development is done in small groups or it's done even individually. Let me give you an example. So one of the strategies that my school was really working on was asking high-level cognitive questions. And we were really pushing the idea of metacognition. And so I would go into classrooms and I would see over and over and over again my teachers attempting to ask high-level questions, but in reality, they were pretty low rigor. You know, so they were asking things like, you know, what is, you know, this is really rudimentary, so forgive me, but, you know, what is the square root of 64? Well, that's a pretty low-level rigor class or question. And no matter how much professional development we did, we just couldn't seem to get there. So it kind of dawned on us that maybe what we should do instead was to do coaching in the moment. So we created this, I wouldn't even say it's a process, it just sort of happened, where we would go in the classroom and the teacher would ask this sort of low-level, low-rigor question, and the students would respond. And then we would just sort of slip in next to the teacher as leaders, and we would ask a high-level, high-rigor question. So instead of what's the square root of 64, we might ask, what would be an instance where you would need to know the square root of 64, and how would you apply that to, and we give a real life situation. Requires the kids to think, there's some dialogue and all that. That is what we called coaching in the moment. And the more we did that with teachers, the better and better they got, because they began to understand and see in the middle of a lesson what it is we were expecting them to do. That made so much more sense than us sitting for 3 hours in a professional development session with a paid consultant who was going to come and make money off of us and leave and go away, and we were never going to get any better. Coaching in the moment is extremely powerful. So I want you to start thinking about that, because it is a high yield, very low effort strategy. We also did things like, if a teacher was going to be trying a new strategy and they just wanted some feedback on it, they'd tell us, hey, I'm going to be doing this on Tuesday in my third period class. So one of us would make a point to be there, and we would just give hand signals. So like if it was going really well and they were getting it, it was like thumbs up. If they were struggling a little bit, we'd be like, and just kind of give them that visual constantly. So there are a lot of different ways to help develop teachers with instruction that is going to be much more powerful than the traditional sit and get. Okay, so what burning questions or thoughts do you have before we kind of finish this up tonight? Sorry, I'm got to take a drink here. Okay, you guys are like really too easy tonight. So to close it out, and I am, there's certain researchers that you just love, and so John Maxwell happens to be my favorite leadership guru. I just think he has amazing ideas. So I really thought his quote was especially appropriate tonight. I'm just going to read it to you. Leaders become great not because of their power, but because of their ability to empower others. So as you're thinking about how do you lead data, how do you lead instruction, and how do you lead assessment, I think it comes back to the idea of you absolutely cannot own everything as a leader. You have to really, the mark of a great leader is that you are creating a situation where other people feel empowered and want to take on their roles and responsibilities for the betterment of their students and the school as a whole. And how do you do that? You tell the story. You help them to create their own lifelines, I guess. You create conditions for teams to be focused. You make sure that you have a sense of urgency about why this matters and why it's so important. There is that sort of higher moral purpose behind all of this. The devil's in the details, but at the same time, we have to really understand how critically important it is that our students get a high quality education. And don't forget along the way to celebrate, to motivate, and to reward your teachers. This is hard stuff, guys, and we're asking teachers constantly to do more, and more. But most importantly, foster the culture of your school that is all about success for every single student. And let your teachers lead from where they are, as opposed to that sort of top-down management model that unfortunately so many leaders still use. Give them tools, give them resources, challenge their thinking, let them challenge your thinking. Really view this as a collaborative sort of effort that everybody feels like they can be a part of and be successful to achieve their goals and dreams. Okay, well, we were a little bit earlier tonight. That's good. So what questions, comments, any questions about assignments, about the book, about what we're doing? Okay, y'all are just letting me off really easily. All right, well, without further ado, you get 23 minutes of your lives back tonight. So enjoy. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Thanks, y'all.